Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next deep questions session with Saif here. And today we have a rather interesting question, sadly with a typo that I just realized. What is the difference between the liberation of mind by the jhanas and the liberation by wisdom that the Buddha praised so much? To many practitioners, they sound like the same thing. So maybe we can shed some light on that. Yeah? You want to give it a go, or should I start?
You want to start?
Sure. Okay. I think for that it's kind of important to uh, bring back to mind the idea of jhana and sensuality that the Buddha explained quite often. When you look at the jhana descriptions, especially the stock phrases that probably everyone that is listening to this channel knows, then it starts with quite secluded or thoroughly secluded from sensuality. So essentially, at least according to my understanding, the jhanas are states of progressive withdrawal from specifically sensual intentions, as in lustful intentions, to be even more specific. You can also think about that in negative terms, in terms of metta and aversion, averse intentions. But jhana is specifically intentions of lust directed towards the sensual domain. So this is what jhana is, more or less. And you can be liberated from the sensual domain. You can be liberated from the grip of the senses, so to speak, while not essentially being liberated from samsara as a whole, while not being immune from craving, even sensual craving, to re-arise in the future. So your heart can be liberated from sensuality, while you are still not liberated by wisdom, as in you still have not understood dependent origination for yourself. So the roots, the ultimate root of craving would still be in place. So being liberated through that is a different thing, I would say. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a more like a practical gateway to think about that. I think one thing that I want to mention straight away is that it's probably good if they look the same at the beginning, so to speak. Because if you neither obtain liberation by mind nor liberation by wisdom, then they should just basically seem to you like, oh, it's a permanent liberation. It's in that direction. So at the beginning, that's completely fine. I think once you get to liberation by mind, then you can start to see the actual drawbacks of it. Um, and like Flav says, the main drawback is that the roots of sensuality are still there. Um, Even if it's not in this life, it could be in the next life, in future lives. So liberation by wisdom, one way of understanding it is that it unbinds you from the cycle of rebirth, of samsara, of possibility of any future lives or future being and so on, which might sound quite abstract, but the way towards abandoning future lives, future rebirths, future possibility of craving, is towards abandoning being right here and now, which I think is the main distinction in mind for me, is that the person who is liberated by mind has abandoned the desire towards the senses, but they haven't abandoned the desire towards being and non-being, which means that they're still involved to a certain extent. They still take that liberated mind as theirs. Um, so I think a practical way of starting to think about the difference, just to think about the difference, so not the difference, the drawbacks of being, so to speak, which might sound a bit nihilistic, but um, it's just the idea that like yeah, like any sort of involvement in experience, um, any having to do with experience is a burden. You're having to basically be concerned to any extent. Like even a liberated mind is a mind that's still involved with the aggregates. It's still concerned. It still sort of makes a distinction between non-liberated mind and liberated mind is still interested in holding that together and keeping that in place and all that sort of stuff, it still has to care. It has to be involved, it has to do things. I think that's um, the main burden that someone who's been liberated by wisdom has abandoned. Someone who's liberated by wisdom has understood that they are not involved with any possible experience whatsoever. And that's why it's normally described as like he's liberated by wisdom and then he's extinguished. Like literally on the other shore, anything could happen now and they don't care. They're not involved with it. It's not theirs. It's just doing its thing. Um, but obviously, a lot of that will remain abstract until you have attained liberation of mind first. Yeah.
Um, the person asking this question, um, by the virtue of asking that question, I would say that they are already quite a bit advanced because they do not necessarily hold the view that the kind of jhana practice, as an example, would be a completely different thing from the kind of wisdom practice, if there's such a thing mentioned in the suttas. How, now goes a bit beyond that question. How would a person contemplate or practice in a way that the liberation by wisdom and the liberation by of mind start sounding more or less like the same thing? Because to me, it can almost feel like a milestone for many people that they align those two things more, that they become much more alike. Because that, at least as I see it, at least makes this kind of concentration practice much more right to have a view that they sound like the same thing.
Wait, I don't get what you mean, sorry.
How would you encourage a person to actually contemplate in terms of this question, to align their views of jhana and full liberation in terms of a more holistic level? Let's put it like that. That is not just focused on sitting, that is not just focused on concentration and those things. Because the person in question here does not seem to hold that view, while many people do hold that view.
Hmm. Um,
Because they have done a lot of work already, as I see it, just from reading the question. It seems like whoever asked already shed a good number of wrong views.
yeah. I think the main thing is in terms of having a holistic image of how these things fit together is it goes back to the other question we're doing actually. Having the correct um, image of the end goal fundamentally. Um, I think a lot of people when they start doing like concentration practice and so on, they have like a established view of what they are looking for, and it might be something like pleasure, it might be something like happiness, but it's normally quite vague. It's a vague sort of happiness. So they start practicing different techniques and so on, and they get some result out of it, and they assume that that's what they're looking for. And it normally is because they don't really have a clear image of what they're looking for is. Um, so from the sort of perspective, obviously, what someone who's looking for their own welfare looks for is permanent happiness. It's always permanent. That's the only thing that matters. Anything below, anything that's impermanent, whether it's 1 billion years or whatever, that's not the goal. I think if you contemplate it that way and it actually becomes existentially concerning to you, like that's like temporary happinesses start to feel odd, start to feel unsatisfying, even in a sort of your mind will very quickly get geared towards, okay, the only thing that matters to me is permanent undoing of any suffering. I think if your mind's going towards that direction, then you'll realize the only liberation by mind that I care about is in that direction of permanent undoing. Um, And then naturally you will start to unpick your vices and your cravings and your desires on that permanent level. Like I will give up five precepts I'll follow the five precepts, um, on a permanent level. Like doesn't matter whether it's someone's coming to murder my whole family or whatever. I will follow the precept not to kill permanently, no matter what, because that's what a dispassionate mind does. I will give up my sensual desires permanently. Maybe I'll start gradually, but anything I do give up, I will give up permanently because again, that's my aim. And then at some point, if you practice that way, you will attain the liberation of mind that matters to you, which is going to be for you being permanently withdrawn from, like you say, sensuality, if it's in the case of jhana. Doesn't necessarily mean it is going to be permanent, but for someone dwelling in that state, they only get to there because they have considered, I am going to abandon all of these things permanently because, well, that which is unsatisfying, I'm not going to start eating up what I vomited out. And then they will realize from there there's a bit more work to do in terms of making sure it is permanent then. And that's when the liberation by wisdom comes into play. But then they will see by that point, because their whole mind is geared towards permanent liberation, that those two things are quite closely connected. Um, does that answer your question, or do you have any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it answers it, to be honest. It's just an interesting thing because it proved so difficult to convince, well, not necessarily convince someone, but to provide someone with the necessary guidance to actually abandon their views on the concentration practice, as an example. People tend to be extremely defensive and resistant when it comes to that. And it's difficult to give that up. So I was just curious on your thoughts on that topic.
I mean, from that, I would say, like, I don't want to be like too prescriptive in a sense and be like, they have to give it up. Like, maybe
They don't have to.
you don't have to, right? Um, the point is what you do have to do if you care about your own welfare is to scrutinize it properly and to see if it's in line with your goals. And for that, you have to have a goal in mind, like I said. I think that is, from what I see, the problem with a lot of people is that that goal is not clearly defined enough. And therefore, they will just assume I get a lot of pleasure from it. Like I don't want to say it in like um, underglorify it, so to speak, because they get subtle pleasure from it. In fact, a lot of them, it will help them drastically reduce their vices and their cravings towards certain sense objects and so on. But is that enough? And I think from the Sutta perspective, none of that intrinsically means that it's pure or noble and so on, unless it's actually fundamentally that it's leading towards nibbana. And if it's not, if you're not sure, then you do have to have that duty to scrutinize it. And that's all we basically, I would say you have to do. And then obviously we say that if you do think about that, then you will start thinking about like non-concentrative practices. But that's our opinion. You don't have to you don't have to believe in that.
Even when it comes to people who are of the view that this is a jhana practice, a concentration style, I think basically all of them at least have to admit that this kind of renunciation practice that we often praise is beneficial and will lead you closer to giving up the entire world of the senses, like, because it's all we say, really. So what would be the additional benefit of practicing concentration style meditation as in focusing? That is also something to contemplate. But then again, I think the Buddha quite openly said that the Dhamma is only really for those who are intent on their own welfare. And technically all people are, but the means of that drastically differ. Because sensuality might seem quite pleasant and quite agreeable and quite peaceful at times. That doesn't mean that it actually is. So if you clarify that for yourself further, like is this really beneficial? Is this really for my lasting happiness? It should actually help in
Yeah.
abandoning certain wrong views. Yeah.
I think, like you said, even if like you say, renunciation already is pleasant and does all the practice, the opposite's also true. Where, like, if you're practicing concentration practices and you believe that that's genuinely helping you with abandoning certain sense desires, that could all be true at some level, but it still is the case that at some point, clearly you're going to have to learn how to dwell without what you conceive as jhana as well, unless you think that like a renunciate is unable to just sit alone for a while and not have to do meditation and can't be happy like that. So at some point, even if you value concentration practices, you're going to have to then do the second path of abandoning your attachment to that jhana or what you conceive to be jhana. And that will be then, you will still have to then struggle with all the addiction to activity, unable to enjoy the assault of the senses, without, meditation to calm it down and so on. And then you're just sort of back to square one in a sense. So you might as well just do that path from the beginning, the renunciation, instead of going through this side road and so on. To go back to the question, if I can ask you a difficult question. Let's say someone has done the purification stuff then, like on the renunciate level. They have been withdrawn from sensuality on a pretty permanent basis. They follow eight precepts. They're aware of their intentions, so their mind is peaceful. Um, they now want to extend it towards liberation by wisdom. They want the nibbana and so on. Um, what practically do you think? What practical steps should they take to then push their mind further beyond liberation by mind?
Specifically, practical steps. Mhm. Um, yeah, I think that depends on how far they have taken all of this. If they are truly established in that, and from your description, it sounds like they are quite close to jhana level of withdrawal. And practically speaking, I don't think you have to do much rather than because whatever you want to see is already very close by, since you are not really distracting yourself from that any longer. So the Dhamma is very visible to such a person. All it would take at that point, I would say, is a short reminder. You probably have heard the words of a Buddha or one of his disciples already at that point. And all you would really need to do is to remind yourself to remember those words and well, seek them out in your own experience. You just need that one bit of additional realization, so to speak, is what I would say. And to on a more practical level, I would say that you could just go into non-activity at that point, where you just try to just sit and do nothing, not just bodily but also mentally, so to speak, because you have already calmed the vast majority of cause, greed, aversion, and delusion, the vast majority of urges to distract yourself, to be active. So that would be quite a fruitful practice, I would say, at that point. What would be your view on that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any it's a bit hard to imagine really this magical purified person. But conceivably could there be a situation where they are quite liberated by mind, but they still have certain sticky wrong views. Like we said before, liberation by wisdom entails abandoning craving for being and non-being. So
Mm.
it's that complete lack of involvement with experience, that lack of self, that lack of identification with it. Um, I think something some people struggle with when they're contemplating is that they contemplate like from a distance, so to speak. As in anything they contemplate about experience is from the perspective of their being, almost like they're contemplating not self through their sense of self. Um, and I wonder if, obviously, the person who's practiced renunciation to that degree is going to be, because they're not acting out of desires, they're going to be lessening that sense of being external to the experience of having like some pleasure out there and me over here. But I wonder if even they've abandoned those sensual acts, that sense of being remain sticky, that sense of I am. Um, so do you have any ideas of any sort of practical things one can start to, you know, how to contemplate their experience in such a way where they can undermine that sense of being? Um, yeah, big question.
That that is a rather big question. Yeah? um, I'm not sure if there's a broad formula that you can give at that point, especially since you have talked about certain sticky views. And when you look at the suttas, there were many instances of quite advanced Brahmins, as an example, or quite advanced practitioners, who were just holding a tiny bit of wrong view that the Buddha could specifically identify and then undermine. As in, there was a case of a person that I remember from the suttas, a person who said that this is my view that all views are unpleasant air. And all that person needed to hear from the Buddha is, yeah, but you surely like this kind of view of yours. And then he said, oh yeah, that too must go. And then it just goes with the stock formula of someone who becomes a follower of the Dhamma. So they just needed to have that tiny bit of dirt, so to speak, removed.
Yeah.
This tiny bit of dust removed from their eyes. And I think in the end, it's always on that level for a person who is truly purified in in their views apart from that and their behavior and even in their mental attitude. It's just pushing away the tiny bit of dust. But that can be quite diverse, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. Um, let's give a more specific example then. Let's say it's specifically the dust that they have is that um, every time they try to contemplate dependent origination in the experience, the idea that the aggregates are interrelated or so on, you always do it from an external perspective. Um, they're always almost, it feels like they're looking into experience from the outside. Um, and even if they try to um, see that as impermanent, interrelated, or so on, then there's just another layer removed, which is now identifying with. And it doesn't matter how far they go back, they're always identifying with that. Um, and that's why it feels sticky, right? It doesn't matter where I look, the beings are always there.
Mm.
Um, is there anything they would be able to do that would be able to um, start to undermine that sense of being?
Mm. Again, that's a very good question. Well, if they have already given up sensual being, so to speak, for the most part, which the question kind of implies when they are purified to that degree that they are liberated by mind, then they should already have a very good understanding of this principle of withdrawal, of this stepping back, and have probably included lots of that stepping back and seen it as dependently originated. From the top of my head, I cannot think of anything additional. I must say, what would be missing, so to speak. I would just include all these intentions that arise, so to speak, until there's nothing possible left that could be not dependently originated. So the stepping back, so to speak, must also be included. But as you mentioned, there's always more. There's always an additional layer. But
Yeah.
if you contemplate in terms of dependent origination, that is not technically something that should be able to happen, because if you truly understand the dependency, so to speak, then there is no hiding place anymore. So whatever they might be missing would just be this kind of understanding, this overarching understanding of dependent origination, that something is eluding this dependency. How do you see it?
I think that is the problem though, right? Because like people will keep including, so to speak, but like I said before, it's always including from the perspective of this external observer. And so they will include
They
more.
do the including.
Exactly. They do the including. It's from the sense of self that they're doing it. So even though they will definitely withdraw from a lot of things, increasingly a lot of things, there will always be that excess there. Um, and that's because I guess the sense of self is the reference point for experience. So it doesn't matter where you look or what you do or whatever it is, a sense of self is kind of always in the background. So I think for me, where this comes into play is at some point you have to understand dependent origination in terms of discerning some background of your experience, so to speak, that's not your sense of self. So replacing your sense of self as the background of experience with something that's actually part of your experience. Um, I think this is where it kind of sometimes you need more peculiar instructions because it gets quite subtle in terms of how you attend to your experience in a skillful way that undermines your sense of being. Um, so fundamentally, instead of trying to include things from your sense of being an external observer, you kind of have to include that observer
Yeah.
within something else. And obviously, if your whole being is included within it, then you can't discern it in an ordinary way, in the same way that I might like look at one of my feelings or sort of look at some external object, because that's something that I'm in some sense external to. But for the experience as a whole, you can't step outside of that. Um, so I can't step fundamentally outside of my perception to get a perspective onto it. I can't step outside of my feeling to get a perspective on it because the feeling is my experience. Um, so I think at some point, like you are renounced sense desires and so on. This is what you have to start to discern that actually anytime I try to externally look at my experience, I can only do that on the basis of experience being there already. And the reason why that's actually quite purifying is because, like we said, you can't discern that in an ordinary way. You can't make it into an object of your experience. It's something in the background. Um, but again, you can't discern the background because you can't like experience it directly. You can only do it indirectly. Then it's always going to be on the basis of the foreground that you're discerning the background, so to speak. And I think because you always have both together and they're kind of inseparable. Like as soon as I discern the background, I discern the foreground. As soon as I discern the foreground, I discern the background. Like literally any time I try to externally look upon experience, I say, okay, no, I can only do that because experience as a whole is already there. Um, you'll start to realize that there are just those two things there, and any self that's in between is kind of just, there's no need to be there. So I think that's kind of how you start to undermine the sense of being. But even with that, there's a lot of pitfalls, right? Um, for example, you can still make all of this contemplation something that you're doing and something that you're maintaining. Like I'm maintaining my perspective of the experience as a background and so on. Which means that it's still being maintained, you're still being involved, and that's still your bond. But the point is, like, if you start to experience, understand it on this level, that anytime you try to step outside of experience, it's because experience is already there as a basis for it. You start to realize that that experience is there on its own without your control, and it's there whether you're attending to it or not. Like you said, it's the reference point for your experience rather than your sense of self. And once you start to realize that that's the reference point, not your sense of self, then your sense of self becomes um, unneeded. And then it doesn't matter whether you maintain it or not, because that sense of maintenance is what's now unneeded. Um, I find it quite difficult to explain that in concrete terms. So maybe you have more um, more of pointed way to explain that sort of background relation. But yeah, that's kind of the main gist of what I was thinking.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. The thing is, in terms of specificity, I would say that a person who is already basically liberated in mind or by mind, has a liberated mind when it comes to sensuality, they would need very little of that instruction and would still get it. This is what I was trying to say, so to speak, a bit earlier. But a person who is not established in samadhi to that degree, they would need quite a lot of that specific instruction to move in the right direction, I would say. And when it comes to good ways of contemplating that, I would say that depends a lot on the person in question. And when it comes to their natural interests and natural way of thinking about the Dhamma. If someone thinks a lot in terms of the six sense basis, and that's probably a very good entry point for them. To me, at least, it seems quite natural to see that at least the entirety of sense experience must already be there for me to be conscious of it, as an example, which is a very good entry point in the entire into that principle, so to speak. That whatever I can feel, whatever I can think about, whatever I can perceive, whatever I can intend, is always on the basis of whatever the senses throw at me. And they do that on their own. I cannot control the senses. I cannot choose what they will give to me next, so to speak. It's more akin to it's a passive thing. It throws stuff at me, and whatever. And I'm always late. I always come second, so to speak. And to a person who's naturally inclined to think in terms of the senses, I would probably approach it that way. But a person who is more naturally thinking in terms of, I don't know, the aggregates, I would probably talk more in terms of the aggregates or awakening factors or something like that. Again, I don't think that there's a very good universal answer to that. And I think there's a reason why the Buddha chose to talk about the same thing in so many different ways.
But I think, like you say, it doesn't matter which particular thing they are aware of. It comes down to exactly what you said, right? Which is that wherever they understand that it's already there.
Yes.
That's kind of the fundamental principle. And once you understand that, like you say, all your sense of self and all your sense of being comes secondary to that. Like you don't even have to maintain your mindfulness of it anymore because your mindfulness is secondary to it. But then that's kind of the main thing. I think, and then you start to understand also why liberation by mind and liberation by wisdom is different. Because if you understand that, if you understand your sense of self coming secondary, then you realize that any determination, any particular content of the aggregates, doesn't matter whether it's this life, next life, doesn't matter whether it's this perception, next perception, it's all on the basis of, like you say, six sense bases that are already there and that I cannot step outside of. Then you realize that there can be no involvement with any experience whatsoever. And once you see that there can be no involvement with any experience whatsoever, that's the cessation of suffering fundamentally, because it doesn't matter now what arises within experience. You're not dependent on any of it. And that's why like it's the most peaceful state, because it's unconcocted, it's unconditioned, it's not dependent, it's completely unwavering. Whereas liberation by mind, you are still dependent on that mind. You still take that mind as your sense of center point, your being, and your sense of self. So just to go back to that, like even while we just had this conversation, again, six sense spaces were there. Even while I was not mindful of it, on the level of my understanding, I understand that actually it was already there as a basis for all of my talking, all of my thinking, all of my pondering. And then I might, go do something later, but I understand again, six sense space is already there as a basis for that. And that's basically the direction of contemplation, isn't it? You make that your reference point, and it undermines your sense of self as a reference point, and then you are unlocked, so to speak, from any form of being through that. Yeah.
Yeah. On the most fundamental level, that's exactly how it is. But yeah, I'm not sure if you can transport that properly with a textual description as an example. that difference, so that someone actually understands it better, apart from a person who is already quite liberated in mind. They will probably understand it.
Yeah, like all the stuff, sorry, not to interrupt,
Oh,
all
no.
the stuff we're talking about in terms of you're being external to experience. Like that is what the sensual act is. Like a sensual act is me over here, pleasure over there. I need to bridge this gap and get my gratification through that. So as long as that's being maintained, any idea of abandoning that sense of being external to experience is going to be pretty much almost impossible. Um, the only like on the other hand, if you've calmed your mind, you've literally stopped perceiving pleasure to be out there. You're literally just letting things arise on their own, and there's nowhere to go. Then it's pretty clear that these aggregates are functioning on their own, like you mentioned before. Six sense spaces are on their own, and that just is it's clear as day, isn't it? Like you say, all we need is just someone to point it out a little bit. Whereas anyone before that, they can look at the experience every single way and they're gonna be like, how does this work? How does the background work? How does the foreground work? How do I mix this together? And it's like, well, none of it's gonna lead to liberation because all of it's on the basis of you still maintaining sensual acts, which make that difference palpable and proliferated. Yeah.
So in essence, I would summarize it as, in addition to having a quasi-liberated mind or heart, or however you want to phrase it, you also need to know what to look out for. You have to. You need that something that you can recognize, that non-self, that dependent origination, so to speak, without having someone point it out to you that what to look for. It's even on the basis of a liberated mind or heart, it's invisible practically. It's you cannot see it, but on the basis of this liberated mind, when someone points it out to you, it's right there, so to speak. It's right in your face. Very difficult to avoid even. This fact that the senses are just doing their thing, the aggregates are just doing their stuff, doing whatever, and you are subjected to that. That's
Independent of your awareness of it.
yes.
Like, people think like I have to be constantly mindful of the fact that senses are on their own, but it's the opposite way around. I can only be mindful because the senses are there
Are
on their own.
doing their thing, yes.
That's what unlocks that you being tied to that sense of being. Yeah.
It makes you gratuitous.
I think we got about 30 seconds, by the way. So
10 seconds?
well, 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, anyway, I think that's all more than enough on that topic, I would say. So it's a good point to stop. Thank you all for listening. And if you have more questions, feel free to join the Dhamma Hub server. But until then, we wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.